This is a talk about video archival and presentation for retro video games. I'm Travis TI-783 McGeehan. I work as a full-stack web developer for Gordon Food Service, and I am an administrator with the TASBot team. This is TASBot, if you guys weren't aware, or if you were, that's awesome too. This is a robot, and I'll help explain in just a second what he does. But I'm also an ambassador for TASVideos and a TAS author, so I have the current world record in Pokemon Yellow's glitchless TAS and in the no save corruption TASs. So some of my background here and why I've gotten into preserving old retro video games. So who is TASBot and the TASBot team? Why are we here at MAGFest? TASBot is kind of like a player piano for retro game consoles, especially the NES, SNES, and the N64. And he has help from GBI, Game Boy Interface, on the Game Boy. The TASBot team helps translate these TASs so they can be played back on original hardware, real consoles, and not just in the emulators where they were created. And we create showcases like we had one last night where we created an Among Us in Ocarina of Time live on stream. And the Among Us was entirely arbitrary code execution. There was no ROM hacking. There was no any sort of manipulation except that there was data sent into the controller ports of the console once arbitrary code execution was generated. So we do all sorts of cool showcases like that require precise video capture, because who's going to enjoy it if you can't actually see the Among Us at the end, right? So, and a word of caution, this discussion is relevant mainly to video archival of like pixel art type games. If it's more of a 3D game, or if it's like not animated footage and more like film, it really doesn't work to use these techniques as well. So you still can. They can be helpful for like archival of those kinds of things, but this is really tuned for talking about pixel art archival. So here's 5 problems. This is going to be mainly what we're going to be focusing on throughout the talk, and we're going to get really technical. So by all means, if you don't want the technical, feel free to leave now. But if you do, and that's what you're here for, that's awesome. So we're going to have the 5 main points here. The first one is about chroma subsampling. So this first one is about a technique where in newer footage, like if you have like a Blu-ray or a DVD, they have like less color than they have brightness information. And they do that because it tricks your eyes. And your eyes don't really like see colors as much as they see differences in brightness. So it helps like have less data, and they can make up more of the overall like quality of the video in the brightness areas. But games didn't do this. They didn't do this on the NES era, SNES, N64. So when you try to capture them, you have to capture them at the original. If you're capturing at the original resolution, you have to capture in the full color. And just to be clear, chroma, if you hear that here, that means color. The second problem that we're going to run into is these resolutions are really small. So like on a modern display, especially like an LG C2 or the C3 that just premiered at CES, these are OLED displays, really high resolution, like 4K. And these games that we played on are like 240p. That's like a tenth the size. If you try to show that at the original size on one of those monitors, it's going to be like a tiny little dot in the center, not something you can really watch. So you have to upscale it, and then there's questions of how to fix the aspect ratios when you do that upscaling, and rectangular versus square pixels. So we're going to get into that. The third problem is going to be about how to do the scaling specifically for pixel art. And then fourth and fifth, we have about things about lossy versus lossless compression, when you can do that, when you're using an emulator footage versus perhaps captured directly from a console. And then fifth, when you have art, what do you do when you have art designed for CRTs? So sometimes you'll see art assets in a game specifically designed around having been degraded by a CRT or a composite cable. How do you capture the look of that game properly when the art is intended to be degraded by those older systems? And we'll talk about that as well. So first off, we got to get deeper into what is chroma subsampling. What is chroma? Again, color. Color and brightness are stored separately when compressing video. This goes all the way back to when they had like black and white TVs. Originally, it was just a brightness signal, the black and white TV. And then they were like, we want color TVs. Color would be nice. So they added what's also called chroma. The brightness is called luma, the color is called chroma. And it's two signals. There's one for the difference between red and green and one for the difference between blue and green, or something like that. And those difference components mathematically come out to the same thing as just having red, green, and blue without the brightness component. So you can just translate quickly between the two and you get your picture on your TV. The color, like I was saying earlier, is usually stored at a lower resolution than brightness because this is imperceptible to the human eye. Our perception of color is at a much lower resolution than our perception of the brightness of things. And you can see in the lower right kind of like what that practically looks like. The 444 is when you have every single pixel having its full color. In 422, instead of every pixel having color, the colors are separated into two blocks, but each scan line still has its own full color information. And then in 420, which happens in almost all home video that you'll see, even like 4K really fancy Blu-rays, use 420, where every quadrant of 4 pixels only gets one color. And the rest of the information that you see is all done by the brightness component of the data. And the bottom one, 411, that's actually more like what happens on VHS. So a lot of people look at VHS tapes and think, oh my goodness, this looks horrible. Why is this? I don't remember this being this bad when I was a kid watching a VHS tape. Well, it's because they actually have full color resolution in each scan line. So, but they have almost no color resolution in the horizontal dimension. They have like only 40 pixels, where on a modern TV you'd have thousands and thousands of color information. So that's a bit why with the VHS, when you watch it on like a modern screen, it's going to even have less color information than originally would when it already has very little color. So why does this matter? This is kind of what it ends up looking like. Normally you'd have like that white pixel is supposed to be four separate pixels, but then when you have chroma subsampling applied to that, it makes it look like there's way more colors than there actually are in the original footage, and it kind of makes it look more like a gradient than an individual pixel. And if you were to store 240p video at half the color resolution, you'd only get 120 pixels of color data, and this really doesn't work very well. So let's get into some demo footage. This is all individual types of video artifacts that you're going to see applicable when you have a certain mistake or a certain degradation of the video. I've blown up the artifacts so you can see what they look like, but you would never actually be able to tell a lot of this unless you really knew what to look for. And we're using Atari 2600 footage because it's particularly low resolution and has extremely rectangular pixels, so it's helpful to demonstrate what we're looking at. This is what happens when you try to capture Atari Dragster footage with chroma subsampling. You can see it looks a little bit blurry, and you can see if you zoom way in on the Activision A, then instead of being a single vertical line of black pixels, you have a little bit of shade into the green on the left and shade into the green on the right. And the center green pixel in the middle of the A is actually almost faded to white because it's losing some of the color in that pixel. And this is what we have when we capture without chroma subsampling and upscale it fully to the screen. So you can see almost all of the color information is preserved, including even in the center of that A. So if I just flip back and forth a couple times, you can see again, the color is almost lost where there's just one pixel in the center of the A, and then it's preserved if you don't have this color subsampling problem. The next thing we're going to talk about is pixel aspect ratio. So if you guys have ever seen Displaced Gamers on YouTube, he has some great videos about this, and I put a QR code to one of them. Some of the slides here are going to come from his research on this. And this is a problem where in the NES, SNES, PS1, all this earlier CRT game consoles, they didn't have square pixels. So square pixels meaning for each individual red, green, and blue on the screen, it's going to be on a modern LCD corresponding to an actual part of the hardware of the screen you're watching. Whereas in a CRT, it can just kind of draw a little bit longer along the scan line and have the pixel be wider. So every single console ends up being 4:3 in aspect ratio, kind of like you'd have on a DVD back in the day or a VHS tape. And the output of the consoles was not 4:3. You'd have things like on the NES 256 by 240, and that would get stretched to the equivalent of on an LCD the 320 by 240. So when you store the video, you have to account for this. So like when you store a PC DOS game on the left, this is again footage from Displaced Gamers, we have a 320 by 200 picture, and on the SNES, you'd get a 512 by 448 picture if you stored all the information properly from the consoles. But then when you view it, in order to get the proper aspect ratios as the developers intended, you have to correct for what would happen when you display it on a CRT. And you can see that we know the correct aspect ratio for the game because the developers of Doom, when they created all the art for their game, they created it to have that stretching applied on the CRT. So you can see again here, these are completely different dimensions coming out of like a DOS PC and the SNES. But when you go to actually view them on a CRT, they would end up at the same dimensions. So we know that the Doom developers knew about this problem and actually developed their art assets around it. So we should be trying to watch these old consoles in a 4:3 aspect ratio. Let's see here. And you can see again here, I've got some slides showing what happens if you capture the footage in the corrected aspect ratio and how it kind of creates artifacts similar to what we saw with the chroma subsampling, but not as severe, because you still have the full color information. You can still get green in the center of the A, but you get artifacts along the horizontal dimension where the stretching is happening. And again, if we flip back and forth, you can see the uncorrected footage is just a little bit better when it's corrected for you guys viewing it right now. So, we have a couple other things. One thing I've done is I've combined the artifacts now to sort of exaggerate and show you what happens if you get all these things wrong, like because YouTube does that. YouTube gets all of these things wrong. So if you ever watch old video game footage on YouTube and wonder why is it looking so blurry, so garbled, this is why. You get all these compounding problems. So next we have scaling algorithms. So we have a whole bunch of different ways we can decide how to upscale a video. Like I was talking about, when you have an old console, like a 240p console, and you want to get it big to see on your TV, there's a bunch of different ways your TV could decide to do that. Or your computer, if you're watching on a computer and then it's outputting to the TV. So there's three main different ways the computer or TV can decide to do that. The first one is point. This is almost never used. It's an option in OBS, but it's not common to see it be like the default way of scaling up video. Bilinear is very common. You will almost always see this for TVs, or especially for like viewing a video on your phone. It's going to use this bilinear algorithm because it's way less computationally expensive for like your battery life. Your battery's going to last way longer trying to use that kind of algorithm than the other ones. And then the third one is area, and area is just trying to be like a compromise between point and bilinear, where it only blurs the pixels at the exact boundary where it can't stretch it perfectly. So for example, in point, you can get a perfect sharp square if you're doing like a 4x scale for your TV, but if your TV happens to be like 4.5 times the size of 240p or 10.5 times, it's gonna have like 10 pixels where it's okay, and then 11 pixels where it has to go back and forth. It can't do 10.5 if it's point. It has to do an exact multiple for every line. And so you get this problem of mixed shapes of things. So you'll see here, I've blown up even further so you can see what happens. So like imagine if Link is moving left to right in his sprite and you're blowing up Link to show on your TV. If it's being upscaled with point where it's perfect square pixels, his shield might shimmer in size and be larger and smaller on each step because he might just happen to be rounding to the 4 or 5 times on each step. And this distorts the shape of objects. You guys might have heard of the Mercator projection. If you're map fans, it's the same kind of problem. You get really straight lines in your latitude and longitude if you're doing a Mercator projection, but you get horribly stretched dimensions. So it's a similar kind of problem. And this can be combated by using bilinear. So now instead of trying to make the image scaled up so that you have square pixels, this is what most browsers do and what most video footage does, because a lot of video on the internet is film. It works well with this kind of algorithm. And as it is going from the center of one pixel to the center of the next pixel, it does a linear, that's why it's called bilinear. It's doing a linear correction, so each sample is an average of the 2 points at that point. And it looks really blurry, so it doesn't really work very well for pixel art. It's much better for film. And what I like to use is called area. It is a compromise between those two problems. So you preserve the shape of objects, and it only does a mixing of the 2 pixels from the source footage at the exact part where you can't represent that properly on the size of your TV. So this helps preserve object shapes, and it's been popularized by its inclusion in emulators like LibRetro before it was then moved to OBS and other streaming platforms. So credit to RC Drone on the OBS forums for the comparison image. And there's even more work to be done to get this better in terms of its accuracy in the boundary pixels. So right now, what I'm showing you is a picture that's upscaled using a color space like sRGB. There's newer things called OCLab where you have perceptually linear color spaces. The basic gist of that is RGB, as you've heard of it, red, green, and blue pixels, where they're like 0 to 255 values. Those aren't mapping to like the cones in your eye. They're mapping to some standard some guy in the 70s or 80s created for what red, green, and blue should mean. And there's newer technologies that have been developed since then that actually can store video in amounts of how much each cone of your or rod of your eye should be expressed from each pixel. And when you actually store a video in those kinds of formats, it can average the amount of cones that should be expressed and get a much better and smoother gradient. So that's not being done yet, but that's kind of the future of where some of this technology might go, and you get even better boundaries of the errors between pixels. This is what happens if you have just this problem, just bilinear being applied to Atari Activision footage. So you can see how it's really blurry, but it's not causing the like stretching artifacts, or you're not getting like lost green. You can still see there's very sharp green in the center of the A, but it's doing a gradient of the pixels instead of going strictly from black to green. And you can see the whole footage overall is just slightly blurry. And then when we go to the next slide, this is all of the artifacts, like I was saying on YouTube. If you have all these artifacts stacking up, this is what your YouTube footage might look like captured from the Atari. And you can see again, there's almost no green in the center of the A. It's gone almost to white because it couldn't capture that with the color subsampled. And then again, if we flip back and forth between these, you can start to really see the difference between having this scaled properly and when this is scaled using the kind of things that would happen on YouTube. So there's some other algorithm options. Like I mentioned, I'm a TASVideos ambassador. So the TASVideos encoders like to have like compromises sometimes where they'll like combine point and area or bilinear for different sizes. So they might like do a double point upscale and then go bilinear the rest of the way to your screen. And this helps preserve 3D games, like especially really small resolution 3DS games, by smoothing out some of the artifacts from the 3D effects being really low resolution on the original console. But you wouldn't do this for archival. This is more for being able to show the game to you guys nicely on YouTube. Now, the fourth problem we're up to, lossless encoding. So video archivists such as the TASVideos, TAS encoders, tend to prefer a lower compression loss or lossless modes where available, so we can fully preserve the footage of a tool-assisted speedrun. And lossless generally exhibits prohibitively large file sizes for videos, but pixel art and even early 3D video can be really easily compressible because you have large patches of exactly identical colors. And H.264 supports a lossless mode, but it has some really long name that you guys don't need to know. I have written it out there, but it's not very widely supported. So you can see it in like desktop Chrome, but not very much anything else. However, there's a new video standard being adopted called AV1. It's available in Chrome, Edge, Firefox, all those browsers, but it's not available in iOS yet. So if you have an iOS, you're not going to be able to see some of the technologies we're going to show later. But if you have an Android phone, we're going to have some technologies we'll link to at the end of this slide, where you'll actually be able to see live what happens when you view lossless video in a browser. And it can be encoded very quickly. If you guys have an Intel Arc or NVIDIA 4000 or AMD 7000 Series G, all of this latest generation of GPUs are now coming out with AV1 support, but you might need to use CPU encoding to get the ability to use the full lossless and 444 chroma. So this is what happens when you capture Atari Dragstar with lossy encoding. And you can kind of see there's a little bit of noise around the 5 and 6, and that's because the way that lossy encoding works is it's taking these like known shapes of pixels in 8x8 blocks and layering them to try to recreate the original image. And that throws away the ones that things don't really help very much to get back to the original image. So it's thrown away some shapes that help make the 5 and 6 perfect and instead have a little bit of noise around the edges. And then when you compare that, again, with combining all the other artifacts together, you can see how the lossy encoding and the bilinear, all these things together have almost all canceled each other out, and you just get this general fuzziness. You don't really see the loss of color and other things so much. You might a little bit in like the center of the 5 again, where there's just like one pixel that has green. But when you combine all these artifacts together, it just looks like a blurry mess. And again, if you swap quickly between what happens when you're scaling everything perfectly and what happens when you don't have that problem, you can see it's so much sharper when you're correcting on the client side. So lastly here, for one of our 5 problems, we have CRT filters. So sometimes games took advantage of the errors produced by CRTs and composite video cables as part of the design of their sprite and animations. Treating pixels like these squares or rectangles of color versus treating them like they were being emitted as phosphors from a CRT loses this design intent. One thing that's done is called dithering. This is where you have these alternating 1 by 1 pixels. Instead of going from one pixel to the next, it alternates a little bit between the two. And this causes upscaled archival quality footage often to look like a checkerboard instead of the gradient of color you might have seen on a CRT. And some games also did really weird tricks, like on GBC Link's Awakening we showed at GDQ last year. The game actually shows its credits in sprites instead of just drawing lines of text, and it doesn't have enough data to show all the sprites every frame. So it renders half of the characters of each frame of the credits and then the other half of the characters alternatingly, and it just hopes that the LCD will kind of decay and you'll see both of them overlapping. But if you capture it perfectly, this doesn't look right. It looks like your screen's flickering like crazy and something's wrong. So in order to properly preserve footage of those kinds of games that use those tricks, you might actually have to simulate a CRT or other retro LCD display to get the proper look of the game. And this is a great example, again, from Displaced Gamers footage, where on the left, this is what happens if you capture a game in perfect pixels, where the waterfall has alternating lines of blue and then transparency. And when you actually record a CRT, you get this effect on the right where it looks like the character is behind the waterfall because the waterfall has alternating lines of the color overlapping the sprite. And you can actually almost see how, as well in the horizontal dimension, the waterfall's like lines are even kind of blurred together, making it look much more like water than the lines you see on the left. So you can really see it. This is a great example of how a game would have been designed intentionally to be run through the artifacts you'd get on a CRT or the cabling to get to a CRT. And this is just to show you the comparison. This is the effect on the same demo footage I was showing you guys of the Atari. And you can see how there's little dots of red, green, and blue if you simulate the CRT fully instead of just pixels that you can see with the full green or the full black. And it's simulating both, it's called the dot mask or the slot mask, and you can see it's simulating scan lines. And what we're going to get into here at the end of the presentation is a way of actually showing you guys that on the client side. So the video being rendered on your phones with a CRT effect. There's also ways of handling 3D games. So this is just, for example, if you look at Super Mario 64, you'd think that these techniques wouldn't work as well because it's more of a 3D game, but you can see really, like a lot of the HUD elements just look absolutely terrible and don't even have the original colors if you have all these problems in your footage. So like looking at Mario's eye in the center of that HUD element, it almost has no blue, but if you look at the fully, like properly captured art, there is a blue pixel in the center of Mario's eye in the HUD. So doing all these preservation techniques, they kind of make the rest of the 3D art look a little bit jagged, but it really helps to preserve some of the more pixel art UI elements. You might also notice, for some reason, there's a quirk where this is a little bit brighter than this one. Often browsers tend to assume that video encoded with lossless compression was done with a higher quality rendering software like Adobe RGB instead of sRGB. And so it actually renders the colors slightly differently, assuming that they're from a more modern color space. So that's just a quirk to note there. So these are some practical implications for browser playback. The practical upshots here. If you're intending for video footage of a video game to be watched on the web in a way that's compatible across all current browsers, the video has to be scaled up at least 2 times in both the height and the width from its storage dimensions, or like output from the console, and then encoded in H.264 using the high profile, because H.264 is really the only video codec that's supported all over the web. And the 2 times scale prevents that color compression from degrading the video. Second, the video should be stored in the console's square pixel output resolution and only stretched once you get to the client. So I have a tiny line of CSS there in case anyone's interested, but there's ways of doing the stretching on the client side in the browser instead of doing the stretching in the video itself. And then another one, you can't use lossless mode, but you can use higher settings of quality and not have much of a problem because, again, these are pixel art games. They compress very, very efficiently. And if you're okay with not supporting Safari or macOS, you can use AV1's lossless mode. And then lastly, there's another note. You can use image rendering pixelated in CSS to actually get point upscaling in browsers, but it only works in Firefox. So not terribly useful, but we have a tech demo that makes it work in other browsers as well. Practical implications for YouTube. So again, like I said, YouTube breaks like tons of these principles. The display aspect ratio is baked into a movie. You have forced chroma subsampling. You can't do lossless even when the file sizes are smaller. And the best strategy is just to pre-render your upload to 4K 60. This is what TASVideos does for all their videos. They actually often even render them to 8K because YouTube will see the higher quality of the video and allocate more bandwidth to the lower resolutions, even though it's the same video. So you can get better quality out of your YouTube videos by pre-upscaling them to 4K or 8K like TASVideos does. And then when they scale back down, a great example is Game Boy footage. It's great to use a 12 times scale for 4K for Game Boy because when it goes down to 1080, it's a 6 times. If it's 720, it's 4 times. If it's 360, it's 2 times. So all those down scales for different people on different resolutions end up being perfectly sharp still. And then now here's the real meat, and this is why I wanted to bring this talk to you guys. There is a new tech demo that some of the people on TASVideos have worked on, and it uses all of the available mentioned techniques together in combination to preserve crisp footage of very low resolution Game Boy games. It does aspect correction and area upscaling on the client in WebGL2 instead of trying to use CSS. And the only requirement to use a video with a site is that it has to be on the same host. So I actually have a library now on NPM for React that you can use to import the player and use it on any video on your own React site. And then you don't have to worry about cores, or if you want to try to just use the rgbscaler.com site, you can. But any videos you send it have to either be uploaded locally from your system, or they have to be on a site that respects anonymous cores, which is like a security thing that Chrome implemented several years ago. So you can actually do this with archive.org footage. There's a specific way of formatting the URL, and there's some stuff in the TASVideos forums about how to do that. But so you can send archive.org footage to rgbscaler.com. And like I said, this is easily clonable if you go to the react-rgbscaler NPM page. Now, this one, if you have an Android phone, feel free to take out and do the QR code here, and you'll be able to see in your browser live the effects of doing the client-side CRT correction. So I would really love anybody in the audience who wants to and has an Android phone to pull this out and see if you can hit the play button and if you actually get working CRT correction on your phone. Awesome. We got one working here. We got one working there too. That's great. I'm glad it's working for some people. So yeah, any lossless, like original resolution footage from games that you create, you can send through this site and it will correct it to look like it's coming from a CRT. And you can tune the intensity of the effects. So in a minute, I'll pull out of the slides here and show you what it looks like through the slide here. But you can tune the intensity of the effects so you can make it have less of the CRT look or more. And then just some more technical data showing how even for like 3D Super Mario 64 footage, 4K movies on the internet come at like 20 to 40 megabits per second, and you can get lossless Super Mario 64 footage in 8-bit or 10-bit for like 5 to 10 megabytes, or not megabits per second. All that meaning, like, tech people really should be focusing more on lossless for this older material, because it's way smaller file sizes even than what you would see from a 1080 or 4K movie you're watching on Netflix. Takeaways there, there's some weirdness where 10-bit encoding can be more efficient than 8-bit if you're having like size problems storing all these movies. File sizes are so small, like I was saying, especially with like 2D or Atari footage, you might as well use lossless. Like the dragster footage, this is like 100 kilobits per second. That's like nothing on web playback, so very small. Again, these are more possible with like clean emulator footage or HDMI capture from a console. If you have analog capture, you might as well use lossy, because all the noise from the analog capture is going to kind of interfere and make it difficult to do the same sort of efficiency of lossless compression. One thing I wanted to note too here at the end of the talk is there's these things called software-defined Laserdisc and VHS players. LD Decode and VHS Decode have been working on this, and this preserves video at an even lower level than making a lossless capture, because it instead of capturing the output from a VHS player as red, green, and blue, it captures the actual like radio waves that would be coming from the tape drum of a VHS or from a Laserdisc, and it allows future reinterpretation of the signal. For example, if HDR becomes more popular, ubiquitous, you could have the output re-encoded to 10-bit instead of 8-bit for better precision, or you could have better rounding errors. So that's the last slide of the talk itself. And I wanted to jump over for anyone who didn't have an Android phone and just show rgbscaler.com. Like I said, this is using a React library I developed, and you can pull the React player into any website to play one of your own videos on your own website with the same technology. You give it a display aspect ratio. So like I was saying earlier, with all CRTs ending up at a 4:3 aspect ratio, we can just put in 4 divided by 3 for that, and it will do the scaling on the client side, and we can tune the slot mask. So the slot mask being like the red, green, blue pixels. It'll be hard to tell if we make the effect too intense because the screen isn't bright enough. But you can start to see as we go more intense with the effect that the individual red, green, and blue are actually blown up to be more visible to you as if you were seeing the CRT. And you can tune the intensity of the scan lines. So like we go all the way down with it and more up with this, you can see that the slot mask is really happening in the vertical dimension, and the scan lines are more horizontal. So, and yes, you can choose files to upload. So if you have a video that is encoded in 240p, you can throw it up on the site and get the CRT effect applied to it. So that's the entirety of the talk I have for you guys. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be around if you guys have any questions for the next 25 minutes. So yeah, let's just go to Q&A now, and anybody in the audience have questions?
I'm the developer of an emulator for the original Macintosh.
Okay.
And I'm interested in creating screencasts. And I'm wondering, so how much of this advice is applicable to video, which would be, so it's strictly black and white?
The question was, how much of this advice would be applicable to black and white video from, I believe, a Macintosh? A lot of it would be, because you'd be seeing that footage on CRTs. So I would expect that a lot of the art asset developers, for if there were like games on that kind of Macintosh, to be working with a similar kind of CRT when they were developing the art assets. So preserving it losslessly, but then trying to make like a CRT overlay on it for YouTube, that would probably be applicable to that kind of footage. Now, with it being black and white, you probably wouldn't have as much degradation just doing it normally on YouTube. So you could just easily do a normal upscale to like 4K, like I was saying, using like point or area, and you'd get really like sharp footage for YouTube that way, but you wouldn't get the same feel of like watching a CRT. And that's really what the CRT simulation is more about, getting the feel of like those waterfall effects in the game that I showed from Displaced Gamers. Thank you.
Can we download the presentation or something?
Can we download the presentation? I cannot give you a link immediately, but if you go to discord.tas.bot, or I believe there's another way to get to it, but there's plenty of links out to the TASBot Discord, and I am more than happy to share a link there later. Mm-hmm.
So this technology of this website is pretty awesome, but I think that, do you think it's going to be hard for something like a mass media platform like YouTube or Twitch to adopt these types of things, considering how small and niche retro gaming is? Do you think it's going to take more of a dedicated retro gaming streaming website for technologies like these?
Right. That's kind of what I would more expect to happen if this ever takes off more generally and not just as a tech demo. So in a tech demo, I can show you, like I said, it's only works on Android right now. So there's a lot of obstacles to getting a more ubiquitous adoption. You would need some way of having the same thing on iOS platforms. They might adopt AV1. They're part of the consortium that like is pulling patents for it, but they haven't yet implemented it on iOS. So I would definitely expect a more niche service to come up if there were ever anything to come up around this. And it is definitely probably a very, very far out thing, because video streaming is one of the most complicated and expensive things to do on the web. YouTube does not make money. YouTube has never like profited, I should say. They have tons of revenue. Don't worry about that. But they have never really been profitable. So even trying to create something small that can sustain itself is very difficult in the video space. This is possible mainly because the tech demo site is entirely hosted statically, so there's not very much complexity to hosting the site compared to like YouTube, where people have to be able to upload videos to you and then download them again. If there are no more questions, you're free to come up, take pictures with TASBot, for to head out. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Again, I'm TyKevin83. I'm with the TASBot team, and we'll be here. We have an autograph signing at 12:30, and you're where you get your badges if you want to come get autographs from TASBot. Thanks again.
Great.
Thank you.
Just want to get a little picture of the robot.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, do you have a video of the Among Us thing? That sounds awesome.
There isn't a video yet. I'm sure that in next few weeks, there was a video taken last night of the whole presentation, so I'm sure that'll come up on the MAGFest YouTube.
Cool, thank you.
Hi.
Good. What, were able to bring your two little supporters this year?
Oh, I'm not Dwango. Dwango AC is a different guy. We look very similar. But he will be at the autograph signing in an hour, and I think with his supporters.
Yeah, my favorite was the audience constantly said that they always steal the show. They are the only celebrities that outdo TASBot.
Nice.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting talk.
Thank you.
More on the collecting side than the video part.
Okay.
But it's also really interesting to learn more about working kind of in other parts of the retro collection and gaming preservation.
Yeah, there's a whole other side to preserve. Like, you can preserve the games, but you have to preserve the way of actually being able to see them the way that they were intended.
Yeah, which actually that would be the. Are you able to do that like live while you're like?
Yeah, a lot of like LibRetro and other emulators have CRT shader or effects baked into the emulator. It can be kind of complicated to enable them, and also sometimes they take a lot of processing power because it can be kind of computationally intensive to try to simulate like the phosphors of a CRT. in real time. So
Okay.
yeah.
I'll probably just stick with my CR2.
Yes.
The emulator I'm developing has a factored approach where the back end is the emulator and it knows about the 60K and the Mac stuff. And then the front end is concerned with actually getting pixels on the real screen.
Yeah, that's something we're kind of thinking about too with like the advent of technologies like WASM. You could potentially compile the backend to WebAssembly, and then somebody could do this sort of like live playback of the footage in the browser without even having to have a video. It would just be a sequence of inputs potentially.
Okay. I'm not taking a browser first approach.
That's entirely valid.
Yeah, no, I kind of go back. I perceive the web, and yeah, so I have some front ends for Mac OS, and yeah, I can do Linux frame buffer,
Okay.
X11, stuff like that.
Cool.
And so aside from the concerns about what YouTube does and how to preemptively work around that, if I wanted to like distribute video files in a format that's useful to people, I assume that would be like MP4 would be the most portable.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. H.264. That is like the most common one, and MP4 is it's called the container format.
Right.
H.264. So
Okay, so the H.264 codec, and how well would that deal with black and white data? Like it's 8 bits per, 1 bit per pixel. So it's
so it's not even grayscale. It's like strictly black and white.
yes by level, and so that's inherently pretty small. Like the 512 by 342 screen is under 22 kilobytes, and I'm wondering how much of a size impact am I sacrificing by going with a kind of generic codec?
Yeah, I'm not familiar off the top of my head with a purely black and white codec.
I wrote one.
Well, there you go.
So the next question is like getting it adopted by FFmpeg and others.
Yeah, I would have to look into that. And again, like if you go to the Discord for TASBot, we're always there and like free to ask questions. So
I used to work for Discord's parent company, and I try to avoid it.
That makes sense. We have like IRC. I'm not on the IRC, but we also have like a Libera IRC.
Okay, I am on Libera.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay. Just briefly, what is TASBot?
So yeah, this guy TASBot, he has like an Arduino, not an Arduino. It's called an STM32
I've heard of
in
it.
him, and
Small microprocessor.
yeah, it's a small microprocessor, and he has like various cables for different systems that come out of him, like the NES, SNES, N64, and the STM32 will have like basically a player piano roll of all the inputs to happen into a game.
Oh,
And-
it's for doing speedruns.
yeah, for speedruns. And then it can do that perfectly instead of a human having to do it. And we use certain emulators that are completely accurate to the original consoles, and we work on those emulators.
So cycle accurate.
And even more accurate than cycle in many cases, because cycle accuracy is going to be a bit of a misnomer.
Oh.
So there's things like electrical level accuracy
Okay.
that you have to get to the level of like being able to match the inputs between the hardware and the emulator.
Yeah, fortunately, I don't have to deal with that so much. You have to deal with things that are